Hello and welcome everyone to Tux Tech. Today you are watching the first video in the Linux beginner series, and today we will be talking about what is Linux. Most people watching this have not heard of Linux at all. Probably do not have a lot of experience with Linux. So, Linux is a collection of operating systems built around the Linux kernel. Also, these are referred to as Linux distributions. But Linux in itself is not a singular operating system, it is just the operating system kernel. Now, you probably don't know what a kernel is, so I'll explain that now. On Wikipedia, the definition for the Linux kernel is: the Linux kernel is a free and open source, monolithic, modular, multitasking, Unix-like operating system kernel. This probably means nothing to you, so I'll get straight into defining these keywords. Very simply, an operating system kernel is the part of an operating system that handles the interactions between the user and the hardware itself. It manages very basic processes like input-output operations, process scheduling, stuff like that. Like very low-level stuff. So, we have learned that the Linux kernel is free and open source. Now this means that, of course, free, it is not behind a paywall, it is completely available to everyone at no cost. And open source means that the code for it is everyone can access it, everyone can redistribute it, change it, modify it, whatever. You can do what you want with it. And you can also make contributions to the project. Monolithic. So what does monolithic mean in this context? So, monolithic just describes the architecture of the kernel. It just means that it's one big piece. It's not separated. The kernel is just one large program, basically. And it is also modular. Modular just means that it can be very easily modified by taking bits and pieces out and putting bits and pieces in. You can deconstruct it and reconstruct it very easily. So, multitasking. What does multitasking mean? It means it can do multiple things at once. So, like we said earlier, the kernel does CPU process scheduling. This means it can run multiple processes at once in parallel. Unix-like means it is similar to the Unix operating system, which you might have heard of as well. It first started development in 1969, I believe, and was first released in 1971. One of the people that actually worked on it was Dennis Ritchie, who was actually the creator of the C programming language. And all this was done at Bell Labs, which belonged to AT&T. So now we're done looking at the keywords that describe Linux and what they mean. So now we move on to our next part of this video. Let's talk a bit more about the history of Linux. So, Linux, or also referred to as GNU/Linux, was a personal project by a man named Linus Torvalds, who was a Finnish man. He developed it as a personal project, and then he posted about it online when the internet was still very, very recent, very new. And people started showing interest in his project. And so after a while, he open sourced the code, and he started having people work on the project with him. Now, at the time, he wasn't really doing it to compete with anyone or any other company. You know, Microsoft and IBM, they had their own operating systems for their own devices. But then, bigger companies started adopting Linux for their server hardware. You know, companies like Dell, HP, Oracle, like really big tech companies. And it was because it was, like we said earlier, it's modular. You can really do what you want with it. You can customize Linux however you want. It's stable. That's another reason it's stable. It's free, of course. Those big companies do have the money to pay, but it's free. It's fast, and they can really use it for anything. So even though Linux is free, there are some paid Linux distributions, like RHEL or Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which is really based around providing a stable operating system for the bigger companies with a lot of support. So it is paid. You don't really pay for the operating system. You pay the company behind it to help you, to assist you to fixing things, getting stuff running, and to keep the software stable. Earlier, I also referred to it as GNU Linux or GNU/Linux. So GNU, spelled GNU or capital, stands for GNU's Not Unix, which was developed as a free substitute for the Unix operating system, because Unix is proprietary. You don't have to pay for it. And it was a collection, or it is a collection, of free applications, libraries, developer tools, and games, which started in 1984, known as the GNU project. GNU is really focused on open source and free software, and it was supposed to be an operating system that works for the user. You have full control over your system, and of course, it's all free. Now, it still exists, and it does serve its purpose, but the developers of the GNU operating system actually failed to create their own kernel, which was efficient enough and worked properly. So they adopted the Linux kernel, which is why it's referred to as GNU/Linux. All Linux distributions contain a lot of packages that were developed, libraries that were developed by the GNU project, which is also why it's referred to as GNU Linux. Both support open source, free software. Like I said, like we know already, the Linux kernel is free, and you're generally not allowed to resell the Linux kernel. Not like every Linux distribution is free. The Red Hat Enterprise Linux that I mentioned earlier, it's paid for corporations, but you pay for the support, not for the product. I'm pretty sure you can also use Red Hat Linux by itself, for yourself. You don't have to pay for it. You're not allowed to sell the product for your own benefit. Linux kernel is licensed under the GNU General Public License 2 or GPL2, which states that it is free. You can modify it. You can do whatever you want with it. You can use it for whatever purpose you could ever think of. But you're not allowed to sell it. That's the key thing. It's supposed to be free. So Linux distro is just different packaged versions of the Linux kernel with a desktop environment, which is the graphical user interface and some tools that come with the operating system. And there's a bunch of them. I personally use Arch Linux and Fedora Linux, which are two more popular ones. Fedora is more based on ease of use. The default version comes with the GNOME desktop environment, which is very modern, very sleek. I like it a lot. And Arch, there's a bunch of them. When you install Arch Linux, you can really choose of whatever desktop environment you want. There's also different versions, like different spin-offs of Fedora Linux with different desktop environments. But really you want to go for GNOME because it's the best integrated one. It works the best. There's also other distributions, like I already mentioned, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, OpenSUSE. Then there's Debian, Ubuntu, which is based on Debian. What else is there? Nobara OS, which is more gaming, work-based, like content creation based, which is made with or based on Fedora. There's a large amount of variety. So I hope this helped clear up some confusion about Linux, and I hope that it was very informative and that it helps you in understanding exactly what Linux is. Thank you for listening.